Welcome to episode 16 of Willing Warriors. We've called this episode A Love for Reading. So to think about this from a biblical perspective, I'm going to take John, the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verse 1. Probably a verse that's very familiar for many of you. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God, and the Word was God. Was with God and was God. So here we have, Jesus is referred to as the Word. He's not referred to as the statue. He's not referred to as the video, the painting. He's not referred to as the film. His story could have been captured in any one of those things. Instead, it's captured as a word. And so here we are. We need to be people who are skilled with words. And just from a large perspective, if you think about it, wherever the church has gone, go back and have a look. And one of the first things that they did, rightly so, was to teach the people how to read. And not only should we teach people, children as well, how to read, but we should give them a love for reading. And that's what we're going to try to cover today in this episode. So I'm going to let my wife start first with how we did that with our youngest.
So with our youngest children, it almost just seems like instinct to just start with basic, and I would recommend cardboard books as opposed to the soft paper books, because they don't know how to be gentle with books. But even at the earliest age, put them on your lap and read to them. And reading to them might be as simple as turning those pages and talking about, what animal is on there? Lots of bright colors. That's red and blue. And generally they're fast moving. They're not long story books. Just those simple, like the children's first vocabulary words, and just sit them on there and read them. And as they get older, what does the cow say? Moo. And it's nice to just have them snuggled. Usually we'd put them on our lap, snuggle up with them. It was funny, years ago when our older children were younger, one of the ladies at our church had watched them, and she said, that's a Whear child. And when they sort of bring you a book and expect you to read to them. So that's how we basically started a love of reading.
So if you can give them a love for reading, teaching them to read it follows naturally. So I mentioned earlier, not only should we be people of the Word, but we should be people who are skilled with the Word. So go back. So we know Adam. Go back to the beginning. We know Adam was created in the image of God. We all are. And think about some of Adam's first tasks and how they involved words. So here's this whole array of animals brought before Adam. What does he do? He assigns them a word, a name. And can you imagine the hippo comes before him? And what better word than a hippopotamus? Or this long, tall thing with a neck? Oh, that's got to be a giraffe. So his first assignment was to give them purpose and give them purpose with words. Next, think about what happens to Adam. His wife, when there wasn't a suitable helpmeet, his Eve is brought before him. What does he do? He speaks poetry of her. So a first man created in God's image, is speaking poetry. Wonderful, beautiful words. You are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So God has created us as poets. Unfortunately, when I say poets, I don't mean something simple like just roses are red, violets are blue. I mean someone who's skilled with words and phrases and picks the right word at the right time and can be succinct. So God has created us to be poets. The trouble is we're really bad at it, and there's not much of an effort in most of us to even try to get better at it. So we'll come back to that a little bit more, but my wife first started with how we taught our youngest to give them a love for reading. Maybe now we can switch to those that are a little bit older and what we did with them.
So the older ones, as we did our homeschool on a daily basis, reading aloud was always a large part of that day. So we would, in order to give them a love of reading and of learning, you have to exemplify that for them for the most part. So we always tried to pick out some good stories, age appropriate to some degree, but as our older children got older, our younger children would still be required to sit in there and listen. Sometimes it was while they were taking naps, but most of the time they were just in there. And as we were reading, they could draw or color or doodle, quiet activities, or they could just stretch out on a pillow on the floor or the couch and just listen. But we tried to pick good stories that were age appropriate. And sometimes you knew you had a really good book if you weren't even trying to do a cliffhanger, but if at the end they're like, just one more chapter, Mom, we have to find out what happens. And sometimes because they really did want to know what happened, and other times they knew maybe after reading we had to go do chores. So just one more chapter, which I usually enjoyed too. I said, I think you're right, we need. But every now and then we would actually catch them sneaking back to the book to try to figure out what happened.
So I mentioned earlier that we talked about God has created us as poets. And so if I were to talk to men today and said, God has created us to be poets, and there is a personification of poets as sissies. Well, let me challenge that a little bit. So David was a poet. David was a poet. He wrote Psalms, and he was a man after God's own heart. I don't think David qualifies as a sissy. He was a fighter. He was a fighter fighting, expanding God's kingdom, fighting Goliath. And yet at the same time, not only did he fight with sling and stones and sword, but he also has fought with words. And those words have empowered us, captured our hearts for Christ long after he's gone. So those words that he's left us, I would say, were even more powerful than the stones he left his sling or the sword that he wielded. Think, for instance, of Psalm 23, how much it captivates our hearts. So if I were sitting in a crowd even with people who don't know of this or aren't familiar with regularly in church, as soon as I start up, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. Oh, yea, that I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You make my cup overflow. So what a great story. It captures our mind. It helps us to stand and fight. And I'm going to tell you that we need good stories to stand and fight. Think about the wars, the last few wars. We don't go and fight against colonialism. We don't fight against socialism. We don't fight necessarily. That's not what inspires us. Communism. We don't fight against these things. We fight based on a story. Let me try to prove the point and how these stories have been impactful. So I am sure during the Revolutionary War, the story of the Boston Massacre was told. I'm sure during the Civil War, the story at Fort Sumter was told about the shots fired on Charleston. Mexican-American War, remember the Alamo was the charge, right? If you're wondering about World War I, it would have been, remember what happened to the sinking of the Lusitania and all those people that died. What inspired so many to join the Army, Navy during World War II? It was the story about Pearl Harbor. And now up to most recent times, don't forget those Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, and the damage that was done there. So it's those stories and how well we know the story, or it doesn't matter, that empower us, that take us to action. So I let my wife talk a little bit about how we actually taught our children how to read, the mechanics of it.
So before I forget, I also want to encourage you. He's been talking a lot about poetry. And yes, if you're just jumping in, that can seem rather daunting. I would encourage you or direct you to writing haiku poetry, because it's very simple verse. It has so many syllables in 3 lines. And it's fun. It's easy. You can do it around the dinner table just as a fun exercise. But anyway, developing a love for reading will often spawn the desire to be able to read. How many times have you seen a little child crawl up on I have videos of my little grandchildren. They crawl up with the book. We're talking 18-month-old children, and they may have the book upside down, but they're talking and reading and turning pages. So if you just have the desire to do that, they want to imitate. They want to be able to read the story. So there is a temptation, moms and dads. So sometimes if you try to attempt to teach a child too early, it can be very frustrating for everybody, for mom and child. So I'm not saying you have to have them reading by this age. We had some that started reading at 3.5, and others that were 6, 7, 8 years old. And but they all learn to read, and for the most part, I think they all enjoy reading. But if they're not currently reading, go ahead and continue reading to them. I was still reading when we had read aloud time. I was still reading to some of my high schoolers, not because they needed mom to read for them, but it was just a time for us to collect together, and we would have similar story to talk about and talk about characters and learning good grammar and well-written words. So even if your child is not ready to read, just keep reading to them and telling them stories, give them an interest.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we did teach them to read is we're big fans of phonetic, teaching them how to read phonetically. So if you're looking for a way to do it, that's one that served us well. Back to stories. So think about the best storyteller there ever was. Jesus. Jesus was the best storyteller. And think about how far and wide his stories have gone. Excuse me. How many people in the church, outside the church, know the story of the prodigal son? How many know the story of the Good Samaritan? Think about how Jesus, as he told story, he captured our hearts. And when I use the word poetry, I don't want to be misunderstood to be thinking of rhyming necessarily. I mean efficient use of words, whether it's allegories, metaphors, similes, something that's profound, something that captures your mind. So Jesus was an artist. He created, and it talks about it in the beginning was the Word. He created this world with words. He's recreating this world with words as well. He's still doing it. And so we need to be men who are people who are good poets to capture others. And that's what we fight with. We fight with words. We fight to capture their hearts. So men, especially men, let me talk to you, discipline yourself. Learn to be a reader of God's word, his Bible, but continue on with good history, something that's lasting literature, good theology, pick up some biographies, current events. Keep reading, because this is who we are. We're people of the word. And as you do this, you'll inspire the next generation to know how to use the tools they've been given. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those things that are detractors with regard to reading.
So we have a lot in today's culture. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the way of good literature has given way to television and videos, video games, and a whole lot of other, detractions from being time as a family too. So reading takes time. It requires you, for the most part, to sit and hopefully to think about what you're reading. Of course, some reading is lighter, but some of those big detractions, like I said, are television. And being a mom and at home with my children all day, I know there were times when it, okay, mom just needs a little time to do X, Y, Z, and you might turn on a TV show or a video, something for a brief period. But so many things at the touch of a button, and quite honestly, I mean, we can watch books. We can see Little Women on the television. We can see Little House on the Prairie on the television. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's still different than the book, and just processing those words helps strengthen your mind too. And who of us, have trained little ones to sit through worship? And we know they can do it because they can sit and watch a TV movie without moving. They don't even need to use the potty during that time. So just use caution and that sort of common sense. There are tons of lists of good books. Honey for a Child's Heart by Gladys Hunt. I'm sure I haven't looked recently because our children are a lot older now, but there are so many lists of classic books, good children's literature. Dad used to take the children to the library. They'd all have a book bag, a fabric bag, and they would go and pick out all the books. They could hardly wait till they got home to be able to read them. But please use caution. In my experience over the last 5 years, many libraries are not what they used to be. And I'm sure there were always some, and I'm talking in the children's section. There are so many gender type things out there, and there's just because it's in the children's section, don't automatically, and it's got pictures, don't automatically assume that that might be the book that you want in your home. So you might want to just go through, and you don't have to read every one page to page, but get a feel for what it is. I did that once, and I was horrified at something that came home with us. So be on your guard.
All right. Well, let me try to wrap this up a little bit. And so words weaved make a powerful story. Stories shape our families. They shape our children. So not only tell your children stories from the Bible, stories from history, tell them stories about you. Tell them stories about your childhood, about your grandparents. Tell them stories about harrowing experiences that you had, and watch them. They will just eat that up, right? Tell them about God's grace. Help them develop a rich imagination. We need this especially now, because as we go and fight, we need not to see the world as it is, but as it could be. As we read God's word, we get a picture of how it could be with our imagination, with his promises, and then we can be used by God to shape the world, especially as we read stories about others and how they were used to shape the world. So we would ask you to be willing warriors, discipline yourself, take up the love for reading, and pass this on to your children. So would you like to close us out?
We appreciate you being with us. Hope you've been encouraged. Until next time.